Kendall stepped outside, taking a deep, calming breath, seeking solace from the overwhelming burden of knowing others' fates. The hustle and bustle of the small town momentarily faded as she closed her eyes. In this close-knit community, she was revered as the woman who could predict one's future by merely tracing the lines of their hands. To many, her gift was a blessing, a chance to peek into days yet to come. However, for Kendall, this ability often felt more like a heavy chain, weighing her down. The joyous moments were easy. When she saw love, prosperity, or imminent success, she would relay the message with a gleaming smile. The recipient's eyes would dance with excitement, their faces glowing with a mix of disbelief and joy. But not all futures were painted in bright colors. At times, the lines on a person's palm would tell tales of despair, trials, or the grim shadow of death. These readings, filled with darkness and uncertainty, were the hardest. How could she possibly shatter someone's hope with such news? The weight of responsibility made her heart heavy. To spare both herself and the person seeking insight, Kendall found a way to navigate these murky waters. Whenever she came across a future that was particularly troubling or foreboding, she'd simply say, "I see nothing." This phrase became her shield, a protective barrier between the harsh truth of fate and the hopeful hearts of the town folk. The reactions were varied and intense. Some became agitated, their voices rising in anger, accusing Kendall of deception and trickery. Their faces would flush red, feeling betrayed by someone they trusted. In contrast, a few seemed to grasp the unspoken message behind her words. With a heavy sigh and a nod, these individuals recognized the weight of her silence. They'd murmur a quiet thank you, and then, with a somber demeanor, slowly walk away. Witnessing their drooping shoulders and downcast eyes, an overwhelming sadness tugged at Kendall's heart. Having built a reputation in the town, Kendall was often approached by familiar faces, eager for a glimpse into their destinies. Reading for friends and acquaintances was especially challenging for her. She feared that revealing certain futures could jeopardize the bond they shared. An unexpected revelation might lead to bitterness or mistrust. Yet despite her reservations, some were so persistent, believing that knowing the future would give them some semblance of control. Mrs. Bennett, with her fiery spirit and relentless curiosity, was a prime example. She would often corner Kendall during town gatherings, her eyes gleaming with excitement and expectation. Kendall could never turn her away, no matter how much she wanted to. Mrs. Bennett's tenacity always won out, leaving Kendall with the tricky task of interpreting her destiny. "Good day, Kendall," Mrs. Bennett's voice rang out cheerfully. Kendall spun around, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Ah, Mrs. Bennett. Always a pleasure. How have you been keeping?" Mrs. Linda Bennett, despite her advanced age, was a whirlwind of energy and enthusiasm. Her life's journey had taken her through myriad roles, from the humble beginnings as a janitor to the noble task of teaching special needs children. These experiences, diverse and challenging, had carved out her unique spot in the community. Though she had retired 5 years ago, her passion for service was undimmed. Everywhere you looked, there was Mrs. Bennett, with her infectious enthusiasm. She could be seen reading to children in the local orphanage or organizing events at the senior citizens' home, making sure everyone felt loved and included. Her dedication earned her immense respect. In the tight-knit community, she was a beloved figure. "Kendall," Mrs. Bennett began, her voice teasing, "when are you going to spill the beans and read my palm?" Kendall laughed lightly. "Mrs. Bennett, with your vibrant life, what more do you want to know? You have wonderful children, a loving husband who cherishes every moment with you. What more could you ask for?" Mrs. Bennett raised an eyebrow playfully. "I've got 3 big celebrations around the corner. What if I don't make it to them?" "Ah, come on now," Kendall replied, her voice light with amusement. "I'm certain there are many, many more celebrations in store for you." Mrs. Bennett's eyes twinkled. Life is full of surprises, isn't it? As they continued chatting, Kendall noticed a subtle shift in Mrs. Bennett's demeanor. It was evident she had something more pressing on her mind. Sensing this, Mrs. Bennett leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kendall, I've been meaning to ask you something." Kendall nodded, her face serious. "I'm all ears, Mrs. Bennett." Mrs. Bennett spoke animatedly about a young man she had recently met at the disability center where she volunteered. The boy, likely in his mid-teens, navigated the world from a wheelchair. His movements and the visible scars hinted at a traumatic event in his past that might have robbed him of his ability to walk. But what truly piqued Mrs. Bennett's interest was the enigma of his life story. His memory of his childhood was a blank slate, and details about his parents were foggy at best. What he could recall were mere flashes, disjointed snippets that didn't form a complete picture. Yet beneath his amiable exterior, there was a palpable longing, a desire to understand where he came from and if somewhere in the vast world his parents might still be searching for him. Mrs. Bennett's eyes danced with hope as she relayed this to Kendall. After hearing his tale, I couldn't help but think of you. With your special talents, perhaps you could offer some guidance. Do you want me to read his palm and see what it reveals? Kendall inquired, intrigued by the story. Mrs. Bennett nodded eagerly. I've mentioned you to him. Initially, he was unsure, being someone who leans more towards logic and reason, but he's warming up to the idea. His curiosity is piqued. He realizes that even if it doesn't provide concrete answers, the experience might still offer some insight, or at the very least, a unique perspective. Touched by the young man's story, Kendall promised to meet him the following day. She approached the impending reading with a mix of anticipation and caution. Often, individuals turn to her seeking solace more than answers. Kendall recognized the importance of her role. She may not always have the solutions, but she could offer words of comfort and hope. That night, Kendall was gripped by the same haunting nightmare that had plagued her sleep countless times before. In the chilling depths of her dream, her grandmother's face, twisted with a macabre laughter, filled her vision. Holding her precious 3-year-old son Mitchell tightly in her arms, she made a heart-wrenching leap off a jagged cliff, plunging into the fierce and raging river below. Little Mitchell, with his curly hair and innocent eyes, was merely a toddler when the tragedy struck. The community rallied around Kendall during those bleak days. People from all corners poured in to assist. Dedicated volunteers scoured the banks, rescue teams waded through the perilous waters, helicopters hovered above, scanning the expanse, and agile kayak teams navigated treacherous rapids all the way to the waterfall. Yet the waters remained silent, withholding any signs of Mitchell and the grandmother. Kendall was just 25 then, a young mother whose world crumbled in a heartbeat. The weight of the sorrow and shock was so profound that it manifested physically. Her once vibrant hair transformed practically overnight into a ghostly shade of white. The tapestry of Kendall's past was woven with threads of mystery and whispers of secrets. Her childhood was predominantly shaped by the presence of her grandmother, Cassandra, under whose care she grew up in their secluded village. In this quiet hamlet, Cassandra was an enigma. To many villagers, she was an outsider, even though she had lived among them for ages. Suspicion and fear clung to her like a second skin. Hushed voices would label her as unhinged, a witch, or even darker names that children weren't supposed to hear. As a result, Kendall grew up amidst wary glances and whispered conversations. For Kendall, her feelings towards her grandmother were a mix of fear and curiosity. The tales of Cassandra's abilities of seeing beyond the visible were common knowledge. Yet there was a sinister side to her that Kendall couldn't ignore. The late-night visitors, strangers with intense eyes and hushed tones, were a frequent occurrence. During these meetings, Kendall would find herself ushered outside, the house's windows firmly shut, leaving her to wonder and imagine the mysteries unfolding within. Regarding her own parents, Kendall's knowledge was based solely on the sporadic stories her grandmother chose to share. According to Cassandra, they had perished in the car accident when Kendall was but an infant. Whether there was more to this story or not, Kendall couldn't tell. However, one thing was certain. Cassandra firmly believed that Kendall was meant to inherit her peculiar gifts, to continue the legacy that had cast such a formidable shadow over their family. On a fateful day, a group of individuals in crisp suits visited their modest home. As was customary, Cassandra instructed Kendall to play outside. But that day was different. As Kendall busied herself in the yard, an eerie silence enveloped the area. Soon it was punctuated by chilling screams from within the house. Kendall's heart raced, The sounds were unlikely anything she'd heard before.